Guys, I've done it. I found an Italian bike with reliable electronics. Hello folks, welcome back to the channel. Yes, I have bought myself a new bike. I actually bought it a few months ago. Yes, it is Italian. Yes, it is a Moto Guzzi. What can I say? I have a problem. Moto Guzzi in particular, they just managed to worm their way into my heart and stay there, and I just keep getting dragged back. And if I'm being honest, the bike I wanted was a V7, but I thought I'd try something a bit different. I don't like to go back over my bike history and buy the same bikes again, so I just wanted to see what this one's about. It's always intrigued me, and I'm happy to say that this is a gradual, slow burner, but something that I'm really enjoying. And every time I get out on it or manage to take it out for a ride, I am enjoying it more and more. So I'll explain the reasons for that in a few moments. Let me just say though that obviously this is the Bobber, as you can plainly see. You can tell that from the title as well. They do two versions of this. There's the V9 Roma and the V9 Bobber. The differences are very short to cover. They are chrome bits, a more relaxed riding position, and a bigger front wheel on the Roma. The Bobber, as you can see, has this silly balloon tire on the front, which has no real purpose other than to look cool. And it does, luckily, so it can stay there as far as I'm concerned. So let's try and remember some of the stats. I have got my phone there, and I am going to cheat. I'm just going to tell you now, don't judge me. But I will do my best to remember as much of this as I can. So starting with, obviously we have that transverse engine that Moto Guzzi are well known for, that 90-degree V-twin. It is 2 valve per cylinder. It is fairly basic, but I think it suits this kind of bike. It adds to the charm. It's just me waffling saying that I like it, and it's got a lot of character to it. It's got 55 brake horsepower and 46 foot-pounds of torque peak, found at 6,250 or 3,000 revs for the torque. Very clearly, it doesn't like to work too hard up the rev range. That's not going to be to everyone's taste. I personally love it. We have 6 gears on this and a gear indicator on the screen, which is quite handy actually. First gear, I believe, is quite tall, as is 6th gear, so it's kind of like an overdrive, so that when you're cruising on the motorway, you're doing a bit of touring, obviously it's going to sit a little bit more comfortably at speed. Speaking about that, apparently there's an estimated 125 miles per hour you can get out of this thing. I'll believe that when I see it. I also wouldn't necessarily want to sit there. Tank capacity, we have 15 litres on this thing. It is a teeny tiny little tank, look at it, but then it's designed to be more aesthetically pleasing than it is capacious, and it is a cruiser, so they're not really expecting you on a small cruiser like this to be doing huge trips. That will give you anywhere between, I think I've got between about 110 and 140 miles before the reserve comes on. Obviously, you know me, I've broken down in the past because of no petrol, because of bikes not having sensors, and it's a long story, and it was a Moto Guzzi at fault that time. I won't go into it here, but I don't like pushing bikes, so when it hits the reserve, I fill up pretty much on the spot. But I am at least reassured to know that this has about 20 miles in reserve, probably more than that. That's just an estimation from what I've seen, but I will never come close to that myself personally. But it still does reasonably well. Suspension and brakes are pretty budget. They are something that I would probably critique on the V9, but we have Marzocchi forks up front, non-adjustable, Marzocchi shocks at the rear, adjustable only for preload, and they are fairly basic. Braking is also relatively basic. We have a 4-piston Brembo on the front with a 320mm disc. We have a single disc on the rear as well. That's, I think, 260. I've seen it listed at either 240 or 260, more frequently at 260. So I'm going to say 260 on the rear and a 2-piston Brembo. Either way, it's absolutely fine for the kind of bike that this is. We've got a wheelbase of 1,480 millimeters. It's not that long for a cruiser, but obviously it's on the longer side. A rake of 26.4 degrees and a trail of 116 millimeters. You've also got a seat height of 770 millimeters, depending on the seat that you go for. Obviously, this is actually quite slim, so mine's probably slightly lower than that. And we have a dry weight of around 200 kilograms. To be frank, having a little bit of extra weight, I find to be a benefit more than a hindrance when you're actually moving. It tends to make the bike slightly more stable, or at least that's my experience with the bikes that I've owned in the past. Oh, and you've also got traction control and ABS. I fucking hate the traction control and I turn it off anytime I remember, but it turns itself back on. So sometimes I ride with it on and forget, and as soon as it kicks in, it pisses me off each and every time. But there we go, those are the fundamentals on the V9. Now if you come with me, I will take you on the road and show you what that kind of translates to in terms of the feeling and what this bike is like to ride. Let's crack on, shall we? So one of the things that I first got when I rode off on this thing was some shin pain from these cylinders, which, if you're going to ask me if they're in an inconvenient spot, they are. Yeah, and do they touch your shins? Yes, they absolutely do. For the first few miles, and then weirdly, I guess, I haven't noticed that for the last few months, probably because I've found whatever comfortable position I'm supposed to be sat in. It only ever becomes a problem again when you get a passenger on the back and they shift you forward, and then you can feel your shins against it yet again, as I can now. And it gets a little tedious on the left side more than the right, because you use that obviously to change gears, and you have to kind of loop your toe underneath and round. So the power, it makes about 55 brake, I think it was, about 46 foot-pounds. I can correct myself later in the edit if that's wrong, but it's around that. It's nothing impressive or too impressive. It's certainly nothing to shout about, but it doesn't feel slow. You just kind of need to know where to work it, and most of its power is made up to 3,000 revs, so you just keep it low. The irritating thing, or perhaps it's a little bit of a shame, is that you have no rev gauge. So I don't know whether this is 2,000 revs, 5,000 revs. I can take a guess that it's not 5,000 revs because it doesn't feel like it's straining, but you don't want to push it past 6,000. Realistically, you probably won't go that high, and it's irrelevant anyway because you will never know what you're in. You have no kind of indicator for it, but you will feel where it wants to be playing. And ultimately, this bike, it's all about feel anyway. You've got an awful lot of feedback. You know where the bike wants to be sat. I get asked quite regularly whether or not that big chunky front tyre makes a difference to the handling, and I'm sure that it does, but certainly not a detrimental effect on the handling, and definitely not a distracting one. It's not something that I think about all too often, to be honest. If I went back to back and tried this with another bike, I'm sure I'd be able to tell more what difference that makes. But it still feels pretty flickable. The brakes, whilst not exceptional, definitely do the job. If I'm being picky, I probably want a little bit more stopping power on the front, but it's not the kind of bike you're going to rush anyway, so hopefully you're less likely to find yourself in a situation where that becomes a problem. You've got ABS at the end of the day, so yank on as hard as you want if you need to stop. The traction control, on the other hand, is shocking. I hate it. It's just an on-off switch for the throttle. There is no kind of subtlety or nuance to it, and it is so sensitive. It doesn't seem to make much of a difference which setting you keep it in, other than off, which is where I generally keep it because it pisses me off. The gearbox is satisfyingly clunky. It feels like it locks into place. Just cha-chong, cha-chong. The clutch pull is slightly lighter than I found with my V7. Mine was the version 2. Don't know whether the newer ones are much lighter. But if you were considering it as a town bike or a commuter, clutch pull is going to be a factor for sure. And then if we're talking about suspension, that kind of illustrates my point. I don't know, it's a little on the soft side. It matches the bike, but you'll want to take it easy. Don't worry about that too much, because of course the ground clearance isn't great either, and I didn't think it'd be much of a problem. And actually the first few miles that I took it on, it wasn't much of a problem, and I was pleasantly surprised with the kind of lean you could get out of it. And then I took it on some slightly more interesting roads, and sure enough I found the pegs ever so occasionally, which you will. And I'm not any kind of bend slayer, definitely not saying that, but you will be able to touch down. Just be aware of it. There are some people it doesn't bother at all, but I find myself just come up on that slightly tighter corner and I tense up just because I'm expecting it. I'm waiting for that feedback through the pegs touching feet, you know. But honestly, I am super happy with this. It works so well for my current situation where I ride generally. Is it going to be the do-all bike that you're looking for? No. It has a specific purpose, specific use. But would I have one, or would I keep it in my stable if I had the room for multiple bikes? Definitely, because on a sunny Sunday afternoon, this is exactly where I want to be sat. So why do I like it? Why does it fit my circumstances so well? It's a bit of a surprise, to be honest. It doesn't look or sound like the kind of bike that should work that well for my purposes. It's a cruiser. It's not going to be the most maneuverable bike. Certainly if you compare this to the Ducati Scrambler that I've come from, you'd probably expect that to do better in traffic. But actually, this one works slightly better for a few different reasons. One, the weight is super low, so it holds itself so planted, even at 1 mile an hour, just crawling along. You don't need to put your feet down, which is obviously great when you're riding through a town. It's also got low bars, which means that they don't often come into contact with wing mirrors. It's very easy to nip through traffic because of where this actually positions itself. It is quite low. It's also really comfortable because those bars are slightly raised and swept back to you, and you're obviously in a more comfortable sat upright position on this kind of bike. The throttle is definitely smoother than the Ducati Scrambler. Maybe it's an unfair comparison. There are much better bikes with better throttle control, but actually I find this one to be great. And added bonus, obviously it makes that power super low. So anything under 3,000 revs and you're happy. For a town and a city, that's obviously really useful. If you're constantly stopping and starting, then you want that power to be found low down in the rev range so it can just fire off and you can be first out of the queue. It also has a relatively tall first gear, which is obviously very good for city riding, and it is pretty maneuverable actually. Even though it's got that big chunky fat tire, which is usually the first question that I get about this bike, whether or not that affects the handling, and it certainly doesn't affect it in any negative way that I've seen. When you think about it, the contact patch is probably only going to be about the same sort of size anyway, so it really doesn't make that much of a difference, and the fact that it is so chunky makes that front wheel slightly bigger than the 16-inch rim you have in the center of it. Then you get out on the twistier stuff, and although it is a cruiser, it's got a decent kind of lean angle. It's a double-edged sword. Obviously you are going to touch peg at some point, and I have done whilst riding this, but you can still lean it over into a corner. And it's got, as I keep mentioning, really nice stable handling. It holds a line really straight and true with minimal adjustment needed when you're actually in the corner. Take it out with some faster bikes and you are going to find its limitations. They are going to be able to get away from you on the straights and probably on the corners as well. I can't really answer that because I've only been out by myself mostly on this, so I have nothing to compare it to, but I'm sure when I get out with other people in a pack, they probably are going to leave me. But once I put my ego to one side on the ride, I'll be able to just enjoy my own ride and more of the view ultimately when I'm out, which can't be a bad thing. Happy to say that this has been a surprisingly good find. I'm really enjoying riding it, and it's a slightly more enduring relationship. It has much fewer ups and downs. It's just a consistent enjoyment whilst I'm out riding it, and I do find the urge to pick up the keys more often than not. So if you're looking at buying yourself a V9, what other bikes might you be considering? Well, the most logical in terms of how it feels and rides and the category that it sits in is probably the Harley-Davidson Sportster, the 883, not the 1200. I haven't ridden the 1200, but I definitely have ridden the 883. I couldn't even really explain to you why I prefer this, I just do. I think in essence it is slightly sportier than the Harley. It's a little bit more quirky as well. You don't see nearly as many of these. It's just got a little bit of extra flair to it. And I didn't try them back to back obviously, but I do think this one performs slightly better. It's a little bit more sporty, ironically of course, because that bike is called the Sportster. The other bike you may well be considering is the Moto Guzzi V7. Now, if I'm being honest, in that comparison, I would buy the V7 almost every time. It offers a lot of the same sort of stuff that this does, but it is slightly sporty. You can definitely get a better lean angle out of it. It is equally comfortable, equally relaxed, equally unlabored on the road. But if you want to have a fast ride, and occasionally you will, it is a faster bike, especially since they have now upgraded it and obviously given it that 850 engine. So if I was buying brand new in this year with the 850 out, all honesty, definitely I would go for the V7. But that is not to say there aren't reasons to buy this if you prefer that relaxed look, if you prefer a lower seat height, a more relaxed cruiser style of bike, then obviously go for this one. Will I change it sometime soon? Who knows? Who knows? Even I can't tell you that, because with any bike in the past, I've gone in with the best intentions that we're going to be together forever. And then inevitably at some point I get the urge to look at something else, and yeah, this happens. But there we go. If you're considering one of these for yourself, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for watching. If you are riding, then be safe out there on the roads, and I will see you in the next video. Ta-ra.